The dust hung thick in the air, a gritty brown cloud kicked up by 50 pairs of boots. It was a September day so hot the sun felt like a fist pressed against your neck. But nobody in Millfield's town square cared about the heat. They cared about business. The kind of business that made good people look away and bad people lean in closer. In the center of the square, a wooden platform stood tall. Usually it was for selling horses, cattle, things a man needed to run a farm. But not today. Today something else stood on those planks. Something that made the crowd push forward with a hungry, ugly look in their eyes. She stood like a statue carved from pure fear. A rough burlap sack was pulled down over her head, tied tight around her neck with a rope that had already rubbed her skin raw. Her hands were bound behind her back with the same coarse rope. She swayed on her feet just a little, like a strong wind might knock her over. Her brown dress was torn and dirty, but even the grime couldn't hide the shape of her, the reason all these men were here. "Gentlemen, gentlemen." The auctioneer's voice was a cannon blast across the square. His name was Pike, a man who'd sell his own mother for a bottle of cheap whiskey. His face was a road map of burst veins, red from the sun and the liquor. A huge belly spilled over his belt buckle. When he smiled, you saw more gaps than teeth. "What we have here," he boomed, "is a fine specimen, young, strong, and ready to serve any man's needs." The crowd let out a roar. Miners with coal dust ground deep into their knuckles shoved their way to the front. Ranchers in sweat-stained hats spat tobacco juice into the dirt. They were all there, their eyes gleaming. "She can cook, she can clean, she can work your fields," Pike shouted, his voice getting louder with every cheer. "And she can warm your bed on a cold night. What am I bid for this prime piece of merchandise?" $50, shouted a bearded man in overalls. He ran a pig farm and smelled like it. 60, called another voice. A mining foreman, already drunk at noon. With every bid, the woman on the platform flinched. You could see her whole body tremble under that cheap dress. She couldn't see the faces staring at her, but she could hear them. She could feel their eyes on her skin like 1,000 crawling insects. The bids kept climbing. 75, 80, 90. Men were shouting, pushing, their greed making them ugly. And just when it looked like she might collapse from the sheer terror of it all, that's when he appeared. He didn't shove through the crowd. He didn't have to. The crowd parted for him, the way sheep move for a wolf. His name was Samuel Hayes. He was tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his fine black coat. Silver touched the hair at his temples, and his face was etched with lines that spoke of hard sun and harder times. But it was his eyes that stopped you cold. They were the color of a winter sky, and they looked like they'd seen things that would break a normal man. He moved slow and steady, the spurs on his boots making a quiet, menacing click with each step. His hand rested on the butt of the pistol at his hip. Not a threat, just a fact. The noise in the square died down as he walked. Conversations sputtered out like cheap candles. Pike the auctioneer saw him and his gap-toothed grin got wider. He smelled money. "Well, well, Mr. Hayes. Come to join the festivities?" Samuel didn't answer. He just stopped at the edge of the platform and looked up at the woman. Those cold eyes of his fixed on the burlap sack covering her head. And for a second, the coldness in them seemed to change. It wasn't cruelty. It was something else. Something like ice forming over a deep, dark well. 125. The bid came from Jake Thornton. Thornton was a man built like a bulldog, short and thick with mean little eyes that missed nothing. He owned half the town and had his sights on the other half. He stood there in his fancy suit, a smug look on his face, like he'd already won. Pike was about to call for higher bids, to seal the deal, when a new voice cut through the air. It was quiet, but it hit the crowd like a physical blow. $500. Every single head in that square snapped around to look at Samuel Hayes. The sudden silence was so complete you could hear a fly buzz. Even the woman on the platform went still. Her trembling stopped. Pike the auctioneer stammered, his showman's bravado gone. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. Did you say 500? I did, Samuel said. His voice was flat and calm, like he was ordering a cup of coffee, not buying a human soul. The crowd exploded in whispers. $500 was a fortune. It was more than most of them would see in 5 years of backbreaking work. It was insane money. Jake Thornton's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. His little eyes narrowed into slits. "That's a hell of a price for a woman you ain't even seen, Hayes." Samuel turned those winter sky eyes on Thornton, and then he smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "It's my money, Jake. I don't recall asking for your opinion on how I spend it." The air between the two men crackled. You could feel the hate coming off them in waves. Thornton's hand twitched, moving toward the gun under his coat. But then he stopped. He was a mean man, but he wasn't a fool. Samuel Hayes had a reputation, and it wasn't for losing fights. Pike cleared his throat, desperate to get things back on track. $500. Do I hear another bid? Going once. Going twice. The square was dead silent. 500 might as well have been a million. Sold! Pike's gavel slammed down with a crack that echoed off the buildings. To Samuel Hayes for $500. Samuel didn't rush. He walked up the steps to the platform with that same deliberate, unhurried pace. The crowd watched, breathless. He stopped right in front of the woman. She flinched as his shadow fell over her. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at the burlap sack. Then, with hands that were surprisingly gentle, he reached up and started to work on the knot at her neck. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear it. "You're safe." The rope came loose, the sack fell away, and the crowd gasped. The woman beneath was beautiful. Not just pretty, but the kind of beautiful that steals the air from your lungs. Her hair was the color of wheat in the sun, tumbling down past her shoulders. Her skin was pale and smooth, her lips full. But it was her eyes that hit Samuel like a fist. They were green as new spring leaves, and while they were wide with terror, there was something else in them. A fire. A defiance that hadn't been broken. She stared up at the tall, grim stranger who had just bought her. She braced herself for whatever came next. But what came next shocked everyone. Samuel took off his own expensive black coat and gently draped it over her trembling shoulders. Then he knelt, pulled a sharp knife from his boot, and with a single quick slice, cut the ropes binding her wrists. She rubbed her raw skin, never taking her eyes off his face. "You're mine now," Samuel said, and his voice carried across the silent square. But the words didn't sound like a claim of ownership. They sounded like a vow, a promise of protection. The woman lifted her chin, and when she spoke, her voice, though quiet, was clear and strong. "I belong to no man," she said. "Not you. Not anyone." A ghost of a smile touched Samuel's lips. "We'll see about that, ma'am. For now, let's get you somewhere safe." He offered her his arm, not like a master to a slave, but like a gentleman to a lady. After a heartbeat of hesitation, she took it. Together they walked down the steps and through the stunned crowd. But behind them, Jake Thornton watched, his face a mask of pure fury. This was far from over. That woman. She knew things. Things that could ruin him. And Samuel Hayes had just painted a target on his own back. As they reached Samuel's horse, a powerful black stallion, the woman looked up at him. "Why?" she asked, the single word holding a world of confusion. Samuel lifted her onto the horse's back, his touch surprisingly careful. "Because some things in this world are worth saving," he said. "And you, ma'am, are one of them." As they rode out of town, kicking up their own cloud of dust, neither of them saw the three riders that detached from the crowd and began to follow them. Their hats were pulled low, and their hands rested on their guns. The sale might have been over, but the fight had just begun. The canyon walls were a blur of red rock, the sound of hoofbeats a frantic drum against the hard-packed earth. Samuel's horse, Thunder, was a magnificent animal, powerful and fast, but their pursuers were gaining. The woman, Grace, held tight to Samuel's waist, her heart pounding against his back. She risked a look over her shoulder. "They're getting closer!" she shouted over the wind. Samuel didn't reply, but she felt the muscles in his back tighten as he urged the horse even faster. The air was thick with dust and the smell of fear. Suddenly, Samuel yanked hard on the reins, pulling Thunder into a sharp, impossible turn. They were headed straight for a solid wall of rock. Grace cried out, convinced they were about to be smashed to pieces. But at the very last second, she saw it, a thin crack in the stone, a passage so narrow it was almost invisible. They plunged into the darkness of the crevice, just as the first bullets started to fly, chipping sparks off the rock around them. The narrow passage twisted and turned, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it opened up into a place that took Grace's breath away. It was a hidden valley, a secret patch of green paradise tucked away in the middle of the harsh, dusty landscape. Tall grass swayed in a gentle breeze. A crystal-clear stream meandered through the center, and shady cottonwood trees lined its banks. And at the far end of the valley, nestled against the canyon wall, was a ranch house. It was a beautiful place, solid and welcoming. "Welcome to the Circle H Ranch," Samuel said, his voice finally losing its tension as he slowed Thunder to a walk. Home. The house was large, built of sturdy timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around it. Flowers bloomed in boxes under every window. Nearby stood a big red barn, a chicken coop, and corrals holding some of the finest horses Grace had ever seen. But it wasn't the ranch that made Grace's jaw drop. It was the women. 5 of them came out onto the porch as Samuel and Grace approached. They were of all different ages, but they all had something in common. They were dressed in clean, simple clothes, and they moved with a confidence Grace hadn't seen in a long, long time. There was no fear in their eyes, just curiosity, and something else. Strength. A woman with kind brown eyes and dark hair stepped forward. She looked to be in her 30s. "We heard shots, Samuel. Are you all right?" "We're fine, Maria," Samuel said as he dismounted and then helped Grace down. "Just some of Thornton's boys making trouble. This is Grace Morrison. She'll be staying with us." Grace looked at the faces watching her. She expected suspicion, jealousy, maybe even pity. She was used to women being just as cruel as men. But all she saw in their eyes was a deep, quiet understanding. Like they knew. Like they'd been where she was. A younger woman with a spray of freckles across her nose smiled warmly. "I'm Sarah. You look like you could use a hot bath and a good meal." An older woman with streaks of gray in her hair nodded. "I'm Ruth. Don't you worry about a thing, honey. You're safe here." Safe. The word felt foreign on Grace's tongue. She turned to Samuel, her mind reeling. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Who are these women? What is this place?" Samuel handed Thunder's reins to a young man who had come from the barn. "Walk with me," he said gently to Grace. "I'll explain." He led her up the porch steps to a pair of rocking chairs that looked out over the peaceful valley. The other women gave them space, but they stayed nearby, a silent circle of support. For a long time, Samuel just sat there, looking out at his land. Then he began to speak, his voice quiet and filled with an old, deep pain. "3 years ago," he began, "I had a wife, Elizabeth, and a daughter, Emma. She was 6 years old." He paused, and Grace could see the memory flicker across his face. "A fever came through that winter. It took them both." His voice cracked just for a second. "I wanted to die with them. I almost did. But my neighbors, they wouldn't let me give up." He took a long, shaky breath. "When the worst of the grief passed, I started to see the world differently. I saw all the suffering, all the people who had no one to turn to. And then I heard about the auctions." His jaw tightened, the muscles flexing in anger. Men selling women like livestock. It made me sick to my stomach. "So you started buying them," Grace said, understanding dawning in her eyes. He nodded. "At first, I just gave them money to get back home. But then, some of them had no home to go back to. So they stayed. They helped build this place. Everyone here is free. They can leave whenever they want. But they choose to stay. They've made a new home here. Together. He gestured to the women who were now working together, preparing a meal. Maria, the one who spoke first. Her own father sold her to pay a gambling debt. Sarah was about to be forced into a marriage with a man old enough to be her grandfather. Ruth's husband died, and his brother tried to sell her to pay off his debts. They've all been through hell. But here, they're not victims. They're survivors. As if on cue, Maria came out with a tray. On it were 2 steaming mugs of coffee and a loaf of freshly baked bread. "Thought you might be hungry," she said with a kind smile. Grace took a piece of bread. It was warm and soft, and it tasted so good she almost cried. She hadn't eaten anything but scraps for weeks. "This is a sanctuary," Grace whispered, looking from Samuel to Maria and back again. "You built a sanctuary." Samuel's expression was serious. "I want to be clear, Grace. You don't owe me a thing. Not for the $500. Not for bringing you here. You can stay as long as you like, and you will be safe and respected. Or you can leave tomorrow, and I will give you enough money to start a new life anywhere you choose. The choice is yours, completely." Grace stared at him, this strange, sad man who had turned her world upside down. "Why would you do all this?" she asked. "Men don't do things like this without wanting something in return." "Because," Samuel said, his voice raw with emotion, "I have more money than I'll ever need. But my life was empty. Helping people. It's how I honor the memory of my wife and daughter. It's the only thing that makes the pain bearable." The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. For the first time in months, Grace felt a flicker of peace. But it was a fragile peace, because she was carrying a secret. A secret that could bring this whole beautiful, impossible place crashing down. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Something that might make you wish you'd left me on that platform." Samuel just waited, his patient gaze never leaving her face. Grace took a deep breath. "My name is Grace Morrison, and I'm not just some poor woman sold off by her family. I'm running from Jake Thornton, the man who was bidding against you." Samuel's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. "I used to be his bookkeeper," Grace continued, her words coming faster now. "I saw everything. The auctions are just the tip of the iceberg. He runs a whole network. Kidnapping, smuggling, murder. I have proof. Ledgers, names, dates, everything. It's all sewn into the lining of this dress." She looked down at her hands, which were trembling again. "That's why he wanted me, not just to silence me. He wanted me back because I'm the only one who can understand the codes in his ledgers. Without me, the papers are just numbers. With me, they're enough to hang him and half the powerful men in this territory." Samuel was silent for a long moment, processing the enormity of what she had just told him. Then he asked a question that surprised her. "Do you have any family, Grace? Anyone Thornton could use to get to you?" Tears finally welled in Grace's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she choked out. "I have a son. His name is Henry. He's 7 years old. He's hiding in an old abandoned mine shaft about 10 miles from town. I told him to wait for me. I was supposed to go back for him as soon as I could." Samuel stood up, his decision made in an instant. "Then we'll go get him, tonight." "You don't understand," Grace cried, grabbing his arm. "Thornton is a monster. He has the sheriff in his pocket. He has an army of hired guns. If you go against him, you'll be putting all these women, this whole place in danger. He'll burn it to the ground." Samuel looked from Grace's desperate face to the women inside the house, laughing and talking in the warm lamplight. "Grace," he said, his voice firm and unwavering, "every woman in that house knows what it's like to be hunted. They know fear. Do you really think they would want us to turn away a child in need because it's dangerous?" He didn't wait for an answer. "We ride out in an hour to get your son." As he spoke, Grace saw them. On a high ridge overlooking the valley, barely visible in the fading light, were 3 riders, Thornton's men. They had found the sanctuary, and they were watching. Grace woke with a gasp, cold dread gripping her heart. It was still dark, hours before dawn, but she knew. Something was wrong. It was a feeling deep in her bones, a mother's instinct screaming that her child was in danger. She threw on her clothes and rushed to the kitchen, where she found Samuel already dressed, a rifle leaning against the table as he drank a cup of coffee. The look on his face told her he felt it too. The air was heavy with unspoken menace. "We have to go," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Now." He just nodded, grabbing his gun belt from a hook on the wall. "Maria is packing food and water. We'll take the 2 fastest horses." They rode out of the valley as the first hints of gray began to lighten the eastern sky. They rode hard, pushing the horses, Grace leading the way through a maze of rocky canyons and dry creek beds. Her heart hammered against her ribs with every stride. The old silver mine was in a remote canyon, abandoned for decades. It was the perfect hiding place. Or so she had thought. When they arrived, Grace's worst fears crashed down on her. The entrance to the mine shaft was a dark hole in the ground. The rope ladder she had left for Henry was gone, with only a few frayed strands left, swinging in the breeze. The dirt around the entrance was a mess of scuff marks and heavy boot prints. Too many boot prints. "Henry!" Grace screamed, her voice echoing eerily off the canyon walls. "Henry, it's Mama. Are you here?" The only answer was the lonely whisper of the wind. Without a word, Samuel lit a lantern and lowered himself into the dark shaft. Grace paced above, her hands clenched into fists, her mind a storm of terrifying images. When he climbed back out, his face was a grim mask. "He's not down there, Grace. But there are signs of a struggle. It looks like at least 3 men were here. They found him." The world seemed to tilt under Grace's feet. She sank onto a rock, the breath knocked out of her. "They have him," she whispered, the words like poison in her mouth. "Oh God, they have my boy." Samuel knelt in front of her, his hands on her shoulders. "Grace, look at me." His voice was low and steady, a rock in her sea of panic. "We are going to get him back, I promise you." "How?" she sobbed. "Thornton could have taken him anywhere. He could be." She couldn't bring herself to say the word. "No," Samuel said, his voice hard as iron. "Thornton doesn't want Henry dead. He wants you. And he wants those ledgers. Henry is bait, and as long as he's bait, he's alive." That cold logic cut through Grace's hysteria. He was right. Thornton would keep Henry alive to use as a bargaining chip. They followed the tracks away from the mine. The trail was easy to see at first, but it soon merged with a well-used wagon road, disappearing into a jumble of other tracks. They were at a dead end. But Samuel had a plan. "We're going into town," he said. "Are you insane?" Grace stared at him. "If Thornton's men see us, we're dead." "They won't see us," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I know that town better than Thornton does. I know its secrets." They hid the horses in a thicket of mesquite trees and slipped into Millfield under the cover of dusk. Samuel led her through a labyrinth of dark alleys and forgotten side streets, moving like a ghost. They ended up in the shadows behind a noisy saloon. "Wait here," he ordered, and disappeared through a back door. Grace crouched in the darkness, the sounds of drunken laughter from inside the saloon grating on her nerves. Every minute felt like an eternity. What if they were caught? What if Samuel was wrong? He returned 20 minutes later, his face dark with a cold, controlled fury. "I was right. They have him at Thornton's compound, a few miles north of here. The place is a fortress. High walls, armed guards, dogs." He paused, his jaw working. "But it's worse than we thought, Grace. It's not just Henry." He looked at her, his eyes full of a terrible knowledge. "They have other children there too. At least 6 of them. Thornton is planning another auction. A special auction." The world went silent. Other children. Grace felt a wave of nausea. The man was a monster, a cancer eating away at everything good and decent. "That bastard," she breathed. "His reign ends tonight," Samuel said, his voice deadly quiet. "But we can't do this alone. We'll need help." Help? From who? Thornton owns this whole town. Not everyone, Samuel said. And there's something else you should know about me, Grace. Before my wife and daughter died, I wasn't a rancher. He looked her straight in the eye, and she saw a man she hadn't seen before. A man who was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. I was a United States Marshal. The revelation hit Grace like a lightning strike. A federal marshal. It changed everything. They rode back to the Circle H ranch as if the devil himself were on their heels. When they arrived, the women were waiting on the porch, their faces etched with worry. Samuel quickly laid out the horrifying situation. While he spoke, Grace went to her room. She came back holding the small leather pouch that held her secret. With trembling fingers, she untied it and spread the papers on the kitchen table. "This is it," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and determination. 3 years of his filthy business, every name, every bribe, every life he destroyed. It's all here. Maria leaned over the papers, her eyes wide. "Grace, this is enough to hang half the men in this territory." "Then that's what we'll do," Samuel said. "But first, we get those children out." "Ruth," he said, turning to the older woman, "I need you to ride. Ride for Carson City. Find Marshal Williams. Tell him Samuel Hayes sent you. Tell him it's a federal matter. Give him these." He handed her a copy of the most damning pages. "Don't stop for anything." "What about us?" asked Sarah, the young redhead. Samuel looked around at the small group of women, their faces set and determined. "We," he said, "are going to get the children." A new kind of hope, fierce and sharp, ignited in Grace's chest. "His compound is like a fortress," she said, her mind already working, clicking through details she hadn't thought about in years. "But I was his bookkeeper for 2 years. I know the layout. I know the guard schedules. I know his weaknesses." She looked at Samuel, a silent promise passing between them. "I know how to get in." Samuel checked his pistol, the metallic click loud in the quiet room. He looked at the faces around him. Grace, Maria, Sarah. They weren't just victims anymore. They were soldiers in a war they hadn't asked for, but one they intended to win. "Let's go bring those children home," he said. The moon was a pale, broken fingernail in the ink-black sky. Samuel, Grace, and Maria moved like shadows through the tall grass, the walls of Thornton's compound looming ahead of them. It was even more intimidating up close. A 10-foot wooden palisade, topped with cruel-looking barbed wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, and lanterns cast pools of yellow light, creating a no-man's land between the shadows. They could hear the restless barking of dogs from inside. "The guard changes in 10 minutes, Grace whispered, her eyes on the small pocket watch Samuel had given her. "That will be our only chance." Samuel gave a curt nod, his hand resting on his pistol. Maria clutched a heavy canvas bag filled with supplies, rope, bandages, water, and food for the children. They waited, their hearts pounding in the oppressive silence. A guard shuffled past on the walkway above them, his lantern swinging, casting dancing shadows. He looked half asleep. Perfect. The moment he turned the corner, Samuel made a stirrup with his hands. "Go!" he grunted. Grace scrambled up, grabbing the top of the wall. She swung a leg over, ignoring the barbs that tore at her clothes, and dropped silently into the dirt on the other side. A quick look around confirmed the courtyard was empty. She gave a low whistle, the signal they had agreed on. A rope snaked over the wall, and moments later, Samuel and Maria joined her. The compound was a small, self-contained village of evil, a large main house, stables, barracks for Thornton's men. Grace led them through the maze of buildings, sticking to the deepest shadows, their feet making no sound on the packed earth. They were almost to their target, a low, windowless building on the north side of the compound, when everything went wrong. A single dog started to bark, a sharp, frantic sound. Then another joined in, and another, until the night was filled with a chorus of angry barking. Lights began to flare to life in the windows of the barracks. Shouted voices cut through the air. "Go now!" Samuel hissed. They abandoned stealth and sprinted the last 50 yards. Grace fumbled at the lock of the cellar door. her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key she'd palmed from its hiding spot under a loose stone. Behind them, men were pouring out of the barracks, lanterns held high. "Got it!" The lock clicked open. Grace threw the door back, revealing a flight of stone steps leading down into absolute darkness. A foul smell rolled out to meet them, the smell of filth, sickness, and despair. And then they heard it. The soft, hopeless sound of children crying. Samuel lit a small, shielded lantern, and they descended into the horror. 7 small children were huddled on a pile of dirty straw in the corner. They were skeletal, their faces smudged with dirt, their eyes huge and haunted in the lantern light. "Henry!" Grace saw her son and ran to him, falling to her knees and pulling him into a fierce hug. He was so thin. "Mama!" he sobbed into her shoulder. "I knew you would come." She checked him over, her hands flying over his small body, searching for injuries. He seemed unharmed, just terrified and hungry. While Grace held Henry, Samuel and Maria were moving among the other children, their voices low and reassuring. "It's okay," Samuel said to a little girl who was shaking uncontrollably. "We're here to take you home." "My leg hurts," the girl whimpered. Maria quickly examined it. "A bad sprain. I can carry her." Above them, the sounds were getting closer. Boots thundered on the ground right outside. The dogs were going crazy. "We have to move," Samuel said, his voice urgent. He scooped up the smallest boy, and they herded the frightened children up the stairs. But when they reached the top, they found the cellar door had been slammed shut from the outside. They heard a heavy bar being dropped into place. "I know they're in there, boss," a rough voice shouted. "The dogs led us right to it." "Excellent," replied a voice that made Grace's blood run cold. Jake Thornton. "My dear Mrs. Morrison has walked right into my trap. Seal it up. They're not going anywhere." They were trapped. The cellar was a stone box with no other way out. "Think, Grace, think," Samuel said, his voice tense. "Is there any other way out of here? Any at all?" Grace closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember the old blueprints she had seen in Thornton's office years ago. An image flashed in her mind. "The root cellar," she said, her eyes flying open. "There was an old tunnel connecting this building to the main house. They used it during the Indian raids. It should be behind that wall." They found it behind a stack of rotting potato crates, a narrow opening just big enough for a child to squeeze through easily, and an adult with difficulty. "Henry, you go first," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady for her son's sake. "Be brave for the other children." He nodded, his small face serious, and crawled into the darkness. One by one they pushed the children into the cramped, dark passage. Dirt crumbled from the ceiling, and the air was stale and close. Behind them, they could hear the splintering crash of an axe against the cellar door. Thornton's men were breaking through. They scrambled through the tunnel, emerging, covered in dust and cobwebs, into the basement of Thornton's main house. Samuel pulled the last child through, just as they heard heavy boots clattering down the cellar stairs behind them. "This way," Grace whispered, leading them to a small, high window she knew was there. It was a tight squeeze, but the children could make it. They were pushing the last little girl through when the basement door crashed open. Jake Thornton stood there, silhouetted against the light from the hallway, a cruel smile on his face. 4 of his men stood behind him, all of them holding rifles. "Well, well," Thornton sneered. "Look what the cat dragged in. I think it's time you and I had a little talk, Mrs. Morrison, about some papers you stole from me." Samuel moved, placing himself between Thornton and the children, his hand hovering over the butt of his gun. The air in the basement was thick with tension, a silent standoff between good and evil. And then they heard it, the sound of dozens of horses, riding hard, surrounding the compound. Thornton's smile widened. "Sounds like the rest of my boys are back. You picked the wrong night to be a hero, Hayes." "Let the children go, Thornton," Samuel said, his voice a low growl. "This is between you and me." "Oh, I don't think so," Thornton said, his eyes fixed on Grace. "This is between me and her. She has something of mine, and I want it back. Now." Grace stepped out from behind Samuel, holding Henry's hand. Her chin was high, her green eyes blazing with a fire that fear could not extinguish. "You mean the proof of your crimes?" she said, her voice ringing with contempt. "The names of every politician you've bribed? The records of every child you've stolen and sold?" Thornton's face contorted with rage. "You stupid woman! Those papers are worthless if you're dead!" He raised his pistol, pointing it directly at Grace's heart. But at that exact moment, the basement door flew open again. This time, it wasn't Thornton's men. 3 figures stood there, dressed in dark coats. The man in the lead was tall and broad-shouldered, with a silver star pinned to his chest. "Jake Thornton," the man said, his voice booming with authority. "You and your men are under arrest by order of the United States government." Thornton stared, his jaw hanging open. "Marshall Williams? What? How? You have no jurisdiction here." "Oh, I have all the jurisdiction I need," Williams said calmly. "Thanks to some very interesting evidence that was delivered to my office this evening." 2 deputies stepped forward, their shotguns leveled, and Grace gasped. One of the deputies was Ruth, the quiet, older woman from the ranch. She was dressed in men's clothes, a deputy's badge shining on her coat. Ruth gave Grace a quick wink. "Turns out my first husband was a federal judge," she said. "I still have a few friends in high places." Thornton looked around like a cornered rat. "You can't prove anything. It's their word against mine." "Actually," Marshall Williams said, holding up the familiar leather pouch of papers, "we can prove everything." It was the moment Thornton finally broke. With a wild scream, he lunged for his own gun. But Samuel was faster, a blur of motion, and his pistol was in his hand. The hammer cocked, the barrel pointed squarely between Thornton's eyes. "I wouldn't," Samuel said, his voice dangerously soft. Thornton froze, his face a mess of shock and defeat. It was over. The deputies moved in, clapping irons on him and his men. As they were led away, Thornton twisted around, his eyes burning with a venomous hatred. "This isn't over, Morrison. I'll get you for this. I'll find you." "No, you won't," Samuel said, stepping to Grace's side and taking her hand. "Because she's not going to be Grace Morrison for much longer." Grace looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Samuel turned to her, his cold winter eyes now filled with a warmth she had never seen before. "I mean," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "that if you'll have me, I want you to be Grace Hayes, my wife, my partner, my equal." Tears streamed down Grace's face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I'll marry you." Henry tugged on Samuel's coat. "Does that mean you're going to be my pa?" Samuel knelt down, his eyes level with the boy's. "Only if you'll have me, son." Henry threw his small arms around Samuel's neck and held on tight. "I always wanted a pa who could shoot bad guys," he said. Outside, the first rays of the morning sun were breaking over the horizon, chasing the last of the shadows away. The nightmare was finally over. But for Samuel, Grace, and Henry, it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. 3 months later, the Circle H ranch was transformed. White ribbons and wildflowers decorated every fence post and porch railing. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter and music, and the delicious smell of Maria's baking. Grace stood before a mirror, looking at a woman she barely recognized. The simple white dress Maria had sewn for her made her look radiant. Her hair was woven with small flowers, and her face, once a mask of fear, now glowed with happiness. "You look like an angel, Mama," Henry said from the doorway, looking proud in his first-ever suit. "Pa is going to fall right over when he sees you." The wedding took place under the shade of a giant cottonwood tree by the stream. Marshall Williams, who was also a licensed officiant, stood before the gathered crowd. Samuel waited, his eyes fixed on Grace as she walked toward him. He looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. The women of the ranch stood beside her as her bridesmaids. The children they had rescued, now reunited with their families or living at the ranch, sat in the front row, their faces bright and smiling. "Grace Morrison," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion as he took her hands. "3 months ago, I thought I was saving you. But the truth is, you saved me. You brought life and light back into my world." "And you, Samuel Hayes," Grace replied, her voice steady and clear. You gave me hope when I had none, and a love I never thought I would find. You taught me that family isn't about blood. It's about the people who stand by you when the world turns against you. When Marshall Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed her, a gentle, promising kiss that sealed their new beginning. The crowd cheered, and Henry let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the valley. The celebration was a joyous affair, a testament to the community they had built from the ashes of their pasts. A year later, the Circle H Ranch was more than just a sanctuary. It was a thriving community. Grace had started a school for all the children. Samuel, working with Marshall Williams, had helped dismantle trafficking rings across 3 states. Maria now owned a successful bakery in town, and Ruth ran a small clinic. They had saved so many, but the greatest miracle was the family they had become. Grace and Samuel had a new baby, a little girl they named Elizabeth Emma, in honor of the family Samuel had lost, and whose memory had inspired him to save so many others. On quiet evenings, Samuel would sit on the porch, his arm around his wife, watching Henry play with his baby sister. He would look out at the peaceful valley, filled with the sounds of happy children and the chatter of the women who had found a new life there. He remembered that day at the auction, when he had looked at a broken woman and seen not a victim, but a survivor. 2 lost souls who had found each other in the darkness and built a new world in the light. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected.